Now, most people don't know this, but the Titanic was the second or third ship of its class to be built. However, the Titanic was originally intended as a luxury cruise ship, while the Britannic had been in use for several years prior to the maiden voyage of the Titanic. And there's a ton of evidence showing that the Britannic was switched with the Titanic, or sort of dressed up to be the Titanic, at some point prior to the maiden voyage across the Atlantic, and immortalized by Leonardo DiCaprio shouting, "He's the king of the world." Now, you can look into the deception surrounding the Titanic, and I urge you to do so because it is compelling. But you'll surely find evidence that the entire sinking was indeed an extremely lucrative form of insurance fraud, which certainly is a solid motive by itself when you consider the figures involved. But the reason I'm mentioning the Titanic was because of another aspect of this historical tragedy, which has to do with specific passengers who perished in the sinking and the timing of the sinking. I'll give you two random dates. One is April 15th, 1912, and the second is December 23rd, 1913. I won't leave you to guess, and I'll just come straight out and tell you that the Titanic sank on April 15th, 1912, with relatively recent evidence that proves the entire thing was a planned insurance scheme, of course, but what is the significance of the second date, December 23rd, 1913? If you said it was the date when the Federal Reserve Act was signed in secret on Jekyll Island by a handful of compromised Freemasonic congressmen, then you would be correct. But what's the connection? The Titanic, or rather the Britannic, dressed up to be the Titanic, was sunk almost 8 months prior and was totally unrelated to the Federal Reserve Act, wasn't it? Well, if you study the facts surrounding the topic, you'll find that basically all of the most prominent and wealthiest and most influential families were invited by the J.P. Morgan, who publicized and popularized the maiden voyage to be the thing to do for all the rich do-nothings of the day to attend the maiden voyage of the Titanic, or possibly not so maiden voyage, which was merely dressed up at the last minute to appear as the luxury Titanic. But these prominent businessmen, politicians, high-ranking military personnel, industrialists, bankers, the movers and shakers of their day, were all invited to participate in the opportunity of a lifetime by none other than the prestigious Rothschilds and their lackeys like the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan specifically. I'll go out on a limb and submit that the mass media outlets of the time were laying it on thick in terms of subliminal programming to entice rich and poor alike into lusting after a crack at the virginity of God's small g on Earth. A quick side note within the side note, the phrase Titanic has its roots blatantly related to the Titans of ancient Greek mythology, which, if taken literally as told of in the Bible, the Titans are arguably one and the same as the Nephilim, the giants, the renowned men of old, the offspring of the fallen angels who lusted after the daughters of men, and ultimately forced God's hand to destroy the world by flood, as told in the story of Noah, during what I believe was possibly the destruction of the original firmament, which separated the waters above from the waters below, as spoken of in Genesis. But back to the Titanic, a novel was actually written in 1898, 14 years prior to the Titanic insurance scam, by a man named Morgan Robinson, entitled The Wreck of the Titan, and about, guess what, a luxury liner that was going too fast in the North Atlantic in April and hit an iceberg, killing almost everyone on board due to the lack of lifeboats. So it would appear that the Illuminati was using predictive programming and foreshadowing their future plans in the contemporary mass media outlets of their time. Now, I've always been a believer in divine intervention. I've actually been clinically dead for a brief period when I was very young, choked on a strawberry and was unable to breathe, and my heart actually stopped for a bit until my grandfather performed the Heimlich maneuver and subsequently CPR. I ultimately survived, in case you were wondering. However, since that point in my very young life, I've always had a strong affinity for the spiritual realm, or a more profound faith in a universal power or creator far greater than anything we could ever begin to imagine, let alone comprehend. So the Titanic, boastfully labeled as unsinkable with its very name, bold and promotional claims of being a vessel that God himself couldn't sink should he so desire, was all a blatant challenge against God and an irresistible adventure for anyone during that era with the means to join the voyage. But getting to the point here, specific individuals who were killed on the Titanic are an interesting bunch of guys to consider, including Colonel John Jacob Astor IV in particular, amongst others such as Guggenheim, Mr. Benjamin, just to name two others. But now, the significance of these men are representative of hundreds of other men of similar integrity and political or financial clout and influence. Astor himself was amongst the richest men of his day and would have been a huge liability for the Kabbalistic group of congressmen who penned the Federal Reserve Act only 8 months later. For the record, J.P. Morgan, the man who funded or ultimately built the Titanic, was instrumental in compiling a very specific guest list to join the voyage, and he himself, J.P. Morgan, was indeed slated to shove off on the maiden voyage along with everyone else he invited. It's no surprise when you understand how these people operate, however, that J.P. Morgan actually canceled his trip at the last minute for one reason or another. I think he said he forgot that he had a ritual sacrifice to manage and execute. No, I'm just kidding on that part, but J.P. Morgan was supposed to be on that ship that day, and was spared by the grace of God, or was he spared by the foreknowledge of the event, and so he avoided the harbor that day like the plague? I would assume the latter. At any rate, when the Titanic went down, I submit that our nation was doomed to become oppressed by the very central banking schemes and Talmudic hierarchical power structures of society which have been prevalent throughout history, where kings reigned supreme and the peasants lived to serve the king, the very motives which compelled the original settlers of America to flee Europe in the first place. After the Titanic, I submit our future was set on course to be pillaged from within, while the Morgans and the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers strategically moved their pawns and rooks to strategic positions, and the only men in the world with the clout, finances, and integrity to block the Federal Reserve Act were indeed ritually sacrificed on April 15th when the Titanic sank. Now, isn't it ironic that the date when J.P. Morgan apparently murdered any vocal or viable opponents to the Federal Reserve Act on April 15th remains to this day the deadline for reporting all personal income tax, which is, by the way, unconstitutional and amounts to literal slavery. So, just like our contemporary Illuminati conspiracies, the official narrative surrounding the Titanic disaster is full of holes and contradictions. It was foreshadowed 14 years earlier in a book predicting the exact scenario surrounding the disaster, while the potential opponents of the Fed were all snuffed out overnight, and the super-rich owners of the mega vessels cashed in an obscene amount of insurance money, and with a slick sleight of hand, it seems that they managed to keep the luxurious Titanic intact by simply switching it with its older sister ship, making sure the entire world believed it was a freak accident, while J.P. Morgan and his demonic cronies penned the Federal Reserve Act just 8 months later, and the American public just allowed it to occur without any dissent or protest whatsoever. And 100 years later, the value of our dollar is literally worth about 3 pennies compared to its value prior to the Titanic disaster. I wonder how many honorable financial, political, or military figureheads were invited to the World Trade Center on the morning of 9/11. I wonder if specific people were intentionally murdered that day so that any chance we might have otherwise had to contest and ultimately avoid, or at least delay, or at least minimize The totally out of control subsequent chain of events, including but not limited to the Iraq War, the Patriot Act, out of control NSA, loss of our sovereign borders, domestic spying programs, and the ever increasing printing of ever decreasing in value currency. And let's not forget the mega payoff to Larry Silverstein, who had just bought into a multi-billion-dollar insurance policy, which unfortunately happened to pay off only months into his agreement. I'm sure Larry Silverstein wasn't very upset the day the towers disappeared. It was like winning the lottery jackpot 20,000 times in the same day. I wonder how many Freemasons were not told to show up to work on the World Trade Center on September 11th. I wonder how many key people were invited to breakfast on the top floor of the World Trade Center 1 on 9/11. There's clear evidence of foreknowledge when you look at certain stock market anomalies during the days leading up to 9/11, as well as the Titanic disaster. It becomes obvious that relatively small, disproportionately wealthy people were in possession of detailed foreknowledge of the impending false flag, pre-planned attack. Such false flag attacks in American history include Geronimo during the 1900s, the early 1900s. An interesting side note about Geronimo is the fable that the Dark Brotherhood of Yale University, known as Skull and Bones, which actually produced Bush 1, Bush 2, as well as Bush 2's opponent, John Kerry. Skull and Bones was the topic of Paul Walker's debut film. But Skull and Bones supposedly has locked somewhere in the nooks and crannies of the so-called Tomb, their secretive members-only Masonic lodge on campus at Yale, wherein they secretly possess and conduct initiation rituals surrounding the skull of the fabled Geronimo, who I submit was the Osama bin Laden of the late 1800s, early 1900s. The crafty and manipulative Freemasons are no stranger to creating exaggerated caricatures of an evil and dangerous archetype whom they themselves have created in order to justify a specific agenda that they had in mind to begin with. Just to give you a few examples, Billy the Kid, Geronimo, Osama bin Laden, the red-faced, fork-tongued, prong-tailed, pitchfork-toting devil, so popularized in movies and shows, ISIS, the current supposed Islamic terrorist organization that was set up, funded, and obviously operated from the top by the CIA or some other non-existing black-budget government program with even less oversight or responsibility to the American people than even the CIA, who arguably killed President Kennedy, certainly played a major role on September 11, 2001. Whomever is issuing the orders down the chain of ISIS command is certainly involved one way or another with the CIA, just like Osama Barack bin Laden Obama was. They could be twins, Barack Obama and Osama bin Laden. Look at the side-by-side photos or superimpose their eyes atop one another, and it is spooky. But it's apparent that Osama bin Laden was indeed a CIA asset and was set up as a patsy for 9/11, a boogeyman to focus the attention of the gullible American public on, akin to a misdirection tactic by some slick magician or sleight-of-hand trickster. While the world was focused on 19 fictitious, many still alive and well, hijackers who basically left "I am a terrorist" clues all over the United States, according to the official story leading up to 9/11. One aspect of the official narrative that immediately struck me as strange, literally on 9/11 in the evening after watching the tragedy over and over on every channel. Really, the propaganda around 9/11 was by far the most concerted effort to get maximum drama and fear reactions out of the population, and was basically inescapable unless you locked yourself in a closet with earplugs on. But what I didn't understand from day one, and I even signed up for the Army and took my ASVABs and physical tests and everything after that. I mean, I was gung-ho, ready to go defend my country from the evil Muslims, just as many of my friends and family actually did as a result of 9/11. But luckily, some minor issues in my past caused multiple hurdles and delays in my fast track towards boot camp, so I ultimately never did sign the final dotted line 2 years and several $1,000s later. You know, you need to have immaculate credit and complete any pending probationary periods. For example, if you had a DUI, you need to complete and pay for all the classes and fines and reinstatement fees, including anything like parking tickets and an I dotted improperly on a previous W-9. So for an average person to join the military, it's going to cost a lot of money, and you'd better have all your affairs in order, right down to your parking tickets paid. Now, I did all these things. I mean, all of the parking violations, but I paid all this stuff off. I took all these steps and, ultimately paid the cost over the course of about 2 years. But when it was finally the day to ultimately sign the bottom line and give my body, soul, and mind over to the U.S. Army, I had since landed a really great paying job, and by that time I had some major issues with the conventional narrative surrounding 9/11. So the way I see it, all that worked out very well for me, just as it was supposed to happen. The point I'm trying to make this whole time is the very day of 9/11, even minutes, if not just a few hours after the planes and or drones and or missiles crashed into those buildings, every single news network had uncovered the exact same 19 hijackers, instantly labeled them as guilty terrorists who flew these planes into the buildings without using the typical politically correct caveats like alleged terrorists or reportedly flew planes or any of the, the caveats that are typically held so fastly to by newscasters and the like.
The FBI knocked on hundreds of doors today, and before it's all over, they will be knocking on tens of thousands of doors. Also tonight, we would like to correct a report that appeared on CNN last night. Based on information from multiple law enforcement sources, CNN reported that Adnan Bukhari and a brother Amir of Vero Beach, Florida, were suspected to be two of the pilots who crashed into the World Trade Center. Today, CNN learned that Adnan Bukhari is still in Florida, where he was questioned yesterday by the FBI, and after taking a lie detector test, today he was cleared of involvement in Tuesday's airliner attacks. We are sorry for the misinformation. Through his attorney, Bukhari says he is not connected at all with this, that he is helping authorities, and that any documents that they found with his name means his identity was stolen.
All right, I'm Mike Springmann. Some 15 years ago now, I was chief of the visa section at the CIA's Consulate at Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. In Jeddah?
Yeah.
People were being brought there from all over the Middle East for visas to come to the United States. And I was told they were terrorists that were recruited to come to the U.S. for training and shipped back to Afghanistan for fighting the Soviet soldiers. But I learned that, it wasn't visa fraud like I thought at the time. I thought somebody was being paid under the table for this, based on a conversation I had with a guy. And I thought that, this was really strange, but I couldn't explain it. And then when Trento and these other people started talking to me, and I said, well, this explains the whole thing. The reason why there was this pressure, the reason why these guys who were not businessmen, who were not educated, who were essentially low-level clerk-type people, supermarket checkers, guys who worked in an auto parts store, why visas were being demanded for them. At the time, I thought that my questioning what was going on, my filing a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, got them to pull in their horns. Reading about the 15 of the 19 hijackers getting visas from the CIA's consulate in Jeddah, I thought, obviously, I didn't do any good at all. I was amazed at how subservient the Department of State was to the CIA, which I guess is natural given the huge contingent of spooks that work for the State Department or who ostensibly work for the State Department. And I really think that the security that they've got, where they've destroyed files or made files disappear that I was interested in. For example, I wanted the cable that talked about the Chinese Silkworm missiles were coming through the Jeddah port. They can't find it anymore. So, the secrecy basically covers up wrongdoing, it covers up incompetence, and it covers up stupidity, and it covers up really dangerous programs that the U.S. government is involved in, like this nonsense about sending terrorists to Afghanistan with no thought as to what happens when the terrorists in Afghanistan don't have anybody to fight anymore. And they're kind of used to this. They kind of like being warlords and making money and writing about being top dog. And I'm willing to bet that the people that were trained by the CIA in the United States for Afghanistan are still in Afghanistan or in Iraq and are happily killing American soldiers and anybody allied with the United States or anybody thought to be in connection with the United States, like the Doctors Without Borders people, for example. And I've been stonewalled for 15 years by the U.S. government as far as the Freedom of Information Act goes. I mean, I'm amazed at how the law of the land isn't the law of the land. But
why would they stonewall you?
Basically because they don't want to give up information. They don't want people to know what the government is doing. Two, because if the truth ever did get out as to what the hell they were doing in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, that people might scream for somebody's heads. You know, it might not happen. I mean, the American people don't want control of the CIA. There's an awful lot of people who think the agency is a wonderful institution and is protecting America instead of endangering America, which in fact it is doing.
So now the TSA ranks are filled with psychotic police academy failures, special forces wannabes, put on their applications for employment, special qualifications with likes to murder puppies with his bare hands, enjoy groping all people, not just women, especially the elderly, and the easily manipulated, highly oppressed, power-hungry fools who are just smart enough to pass the test and just callous enough to pass the character assessment screening, which ensures psychopathic morons get first dibs on TSA jobs. I'm sure many of you are aware, however, the majority of the world has no idea that the third tower fell in New York on 9/11. The now infamous amongst conspiracy theorists Building 7, a massive skyscraper in its own right, which was of course dwarfed by the once humongous Twin Towers. But Building 7 fell even though it was never hit by a plane and no substantial structural damage was inflicted to Building 7. Only a few isolated fires, certainly not enough to cause a structurally impenetrable to fire skyscraper to suddenly collapse as if it were taken down by an expert demolitions team or some type of directed energy weapon, which is not as crazy as it sounds if you've read Dr. Judy Wood's book, Where Did the Towers Go?, or seen the documentary by the same name. The CIA headquarters in New York was set up at the very top of Building 7, and you'll notice that the very first thing to go down on Building 7 is the Grandma's Attic, or whatever you want to call it. I like Grandma's Attic, but you can clearly see the structure located at the very top of the building is imploded just a split second prior to the rest of the building freefall collapsing. Now, did you know that that little building on top of Tower 7 was indeed the CIA headquarters in New York and was very possibly the control center for the entire operation, involving some type of deception ranging from remotely controlled drone aircraft to directed energy weapons, thermite charges? There's all sorts of logically sound reasons for the CIA to set up a front row seat command center containing their control hub, all of it ultimately destroyed in the aftermath of the attack, where for the first time in history, steel-framed megastructures were taken down by a mere fire, and for the first 4 times in history, either 3 or 4 times in history, I guess it was all 4, black boxes in the airplanes were never recovered. So 9/11 was a first for a lot of things. Now ask yourself a question. Do you think the CIA could have played some part in the 9/11 inside job? If they did play a role in it, would you expect them to ensure all evidence of their operational headquarters overseeing the process to be destroyed, along with the primary target, and whisked away to China to be turned into overpriced merchandise by slave labor and sold back to us at a sickening markup? That is, of course, the steel was almost entirely dustified, as evidenced in many clips of the falling towers. Credit going again to Dr. Judy Wood for the keen observation, but you can clearly see that enormous segments of rigid steel framework literally turn to dust in midair as they free fall towards the ground and literally do not even resemble anything similar to an enormous steel frame of a skyscraper by the time it hits the ground, which it really never does hit the ground. It sort of floats away in a cloud of lighter than air dust. Maybe Mary Poppins had something to do with 9/11. Hell, that's more plausible than the 19 guilty terrorists story. Whatever hit the ground was, again, not a giant grid of steel framework, but a wisp of dust that was only seconds earlier a giant grid of massive steel framework that seems to be kind of small from the distances. However, if you consider the scale of the towers and the distance of the observer shooting that film, we're talking about extremely large sections of solid, reinforced structural steel that has been riveted permanently to similar segments of structural steel, amounting to many tons of structural steel literally turning to dust during the 10 or so second free fall. By the time they begin their descent and trajectory towards the ground and away from the building, the steel begins to just sort of evaporate at the edges and turn into dust until the time they float away in all directions, mixing in with the rest of the dust covering all the nearby survivors of the thick toxic powder. Certainly no molten iron in that dust. Certain groups of secretive, greedy, Luciferian elitists created the 9/11 saga to cause instability in American minds, and by using hypnotic suggestion and repetitive propaganda, they successfully tricked at least 90% of the American people, and continued to have some great portion of the population completely snowed about 9/11, even to this very day over 14 years later, with literally mountains of empirical evidence disproving the official narrative. Now, control the minds of the American citizens was a piece of cake, but by extension, the dramatic event caused instability throughout the entire world by fear-mongering, and also, so eloquently put by comedian Lee Camp, the entire institution of mass media has been suffering from severe, terrible case of liarrhea, where newscasters spew out never-ending illogical lies over and over to the entire world for years and simply cannot seem to stop spewing nonsensical lies. When the media is confronted about the liarrhea, they simply have the person questioning them forcibly removed from the situation or from the room. In other more prominent cases of truthers being denied their right to free speech, for example, Ron Paul in his presidential run to 2008 was simply and completely ignored by the media, even when he was actually ahead of other candidates combined in several polls, and was definitely a solid contender in his own right. However, by simply pretending he didn't exist on the national level, the vast majority of the American people knew nothing about Ron Paul other than what they had been spoon-fed by Fox News and the, negative advertisements. You do realize that most Americans base their entire worldview on what is pumped into their minds by Fox News or MSNBC. Ron Paul, I submit, was by far the best choice between the three, probably the best choice for president in the last 50 years, and is a prime example of how our constitutional republic has become a bad episode of Jersey Shore.
Gentlemen, I just heard that you guys are mad at me, but I ain't doing a thing.
Fully.
So I'm mad at you for being mad at me for no reason. So try and talk to me, I'm mad. Pissed.
Get the punch me in the face.
Oh!
We're getting our bathing suits. We're getting our Nicole, really?
Busted! Busted! It's t-shirt time! T-shirt time! He's the sneakiest bitch you'll ever meet! At one particular point, I remember I was in the jacuzzi, and I finally put some water on my face. I was like, we got grenades. And then once in a while, he'll probably look at me like, yeah, dog, keep going, dog. You want half?
I realize I'm digressing. I'm considering changing my channel name to I Digress, but Ron Paul being completely ignored by all forms of national media during his extremely popular grassroots campaign that was down to earth in terms of the actual wishes of the American people, vowing to abolish the Federal Reserve, which would instantly end all financial problems of our country, and by definition the rest of the world, but it would eliminate our financial problems that we've experienced in the last 100 years since the foundation of the Federal Reserve, and for the next 100 years to come if nothing is done to stop this out-of-control group of private banks who literally own everything, including the government, most of the physical land, most real estate, most banks, all government-funded agencies such as NASA, the military, the police, the judges, including and especially the Supreme Court. In case you didn't know, the difference between a judge and a judge supreme is the latter comes with sour cream and diced tomatoes. However, this very same super elite private group of individuals literally own everything, including our very homes, but even beyond that, make sure you're sitting down, but believe it or not, they own a fictitious character which is bundled into an internationally traded bond that is literally, legally, you. I realize how absurd this might sound at first, but if you research Sestui KV and the ecclesiastical court systems of the world operating with their own secret language laid out in Black's legal dictionary and ultimately governed by maritime admiralty law, you'll find yet another example of how seemingly prestigious or esteemed groups of honorable men can be subverted and trick us.
Ah, the government. It loves you and wants to keep you safe and well. It even wants to make paying taxes, fines, and court costs easier for you. How? Well, you'll need to meet your straw man. He was born the same day you were. He looks like you, has the same name, and lives in your house, but you never knew he existed. You will have even paid his parking tickets or taxes. The worst part? He's been dead from day one. From every birth certificate, a legal personality, or legal fiction, is created with the same name to confuse little old you into thinking it's you. So, there is a human you and a paper you, or as it's commonly known, a straw man. So when it seems like government officials, court clerks, or the police are speaking English, they aren't. They're speaking legalese, designed to make you agree to verbal and written contracts without even knowing about it, all spun from Black's Law Dictionary. For example, when the police say, "Do you understand?" you'll say, "Yes." What they are really saying is, "Do you stand under our authority?" Oops-a-daisy, you just created a verbal contract with them. Oh, you clever government. Did you know that whenever you register something, you are handing over title to the person you register it with? That's right. Whenever you register something with the government, they assume it belongs to them. Registered your car? Super! Now you are the registered keeper of your vehicle, and the government can crush it when you don't pay your, straw man's taxes. Expecting a new bundle of joy? Well, then you need to register your little darling with a birth certificate. Then they can start the process all over again and create a new straw man for your little one. Isn't that great? So when Junior grows up, he'll be able to generate revenue just like you have. When you notify on your baby by signing the birth certificate, your child becomes a ward of state. And if the government doesn't like what you're doing, they'll assume it's okay to take the child away or make new rules for things they don't like. Not enough school? Smacking your child? Shouting too loudly? Then it's off to social services for the little one. When you get a bill, it's sent to you but belongs to your straw man, not you. That's why bills, fines, and summons start with Mr., Mrs., or Ms. Sometimes you'll see your surname in capitals, just like on a gravestone. That's because your straw man is dead and just a silly piece of paper, created before you could comprehend or even consent to it. When you go to court, you represent your straw man, so you, the human, take on any costs, fees, taxes, and fines involved for the straw man. The human you doesn't even need to pay them. But you made a contract with the court by appearing on behalf of your legal personality or straw man, just like the government knew you would. Confused? Well, don't worry. The government doesn't want you to know anyway. If you knew, you'd stop paying things like council tax and parking tickets. Because when you go to court, you are representing your straw man. You are you, alive and made of flesh and blood. Your straw man, or legal personality, is a piece of paper created from your birth certificate. And you think it's you. What a silly Billy. Would you like to know more? Well, then go over to tpuc.org. Get up, get informed, and get real.
If you look into this, you'll learn that I'm not just making this up, as when our parents sign the certificates of live birth at the hospital, they are later bestowed with a birth certificate, which is not the same thing as a certificate of live birth. And one major difference between the certificate of live birth and the birth certificate is the birth certificate will have your name printed in all caps. Now, this might seem like a mundane or insignificant observation until you recognize or you're familiar with the scam. Now, it's rather complex, and I won't try to explain every last detail here in this Flat Earth video, and I promise I'll get to the Flat Earth stuff too. But here's the basic premise behind Sestuit KV and how antiquated loopholes in maritime admiralty law have been cleverly spliced into our judicial system, and it seems that Black's Law Dictionary was a way that the secretive elite changed the legal definitions of certain words to manipulate us so-called citizens, the absolute primary detriment to our national stability. Using agent provocateurs to infiltrate grassroots movements, attach wild, irrelevant tenets to the doctrines of the movement, and ultimately steer any grassroots, originally well-intentioned natural movement of the people towards some desired end, often in contradiction to the original tenets or pillars of the movement in the first place. And these agent provocateurs have been doing this for much longer than America was discovered, inhabited by millions of people, yet discovered by Christopher Colon, a man who was so callous and evil, he murdered, maimed, and enslaved hundreds of Native Americans personally, and was responsible for the slaughter of thousands, if not many more than that. And we celebrate Thanksgiving by commemorating the corn and turkey we ate with the Native or naive Americans. I'm guessing the first Thanksgiving was before the part where the Spanish invaders returned to claim the generous and naive natives' wives, daughters, their gold, and apparently their blood should the innocent human object. And we celebrate Columbus Day for an obviously illuminated public of the hidden hand, viceroy of the Dark Brotherhood, anti-human, anti-Christian, psychopathic Christopher Colon, a.k.a. Christopher Columbus, like Columbus Pictures, like Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, like Columbine High School, like Columbia, the capital of South Carolina. For a psychopathic murder and morally reprehensible hidden hand of the Dark Brotherhood, who thinks of themselves as the illuminated, he sure did well for himself, in terms of being highly esteemed among men. and the gullible sleeping giant rolls over, farts, and gets right back to the snoring without skipping a beat. I think it's high time that we as a generation and a sovereign nation of people do one thing if we do nothing else noble in our entire life. Don't observe Columbus Day, and strike his name from all the cities and capitals. So Washington, D.C. could be the District of Child Molesters, instead of the District of Columbia, and it would be far more honorable and prestigious than the previous name, which is reflective of a man who ordered the arms and legs of innocent Native Americans be summarily severed, just really for no reason whatsoever. Columbus was the type of guy that liked to smile in your face and tell you how he likes your shoes and your tie, then waits for you to turn around and drives a candlestick across your skull in the library. I submit that if your office is closed on Columbus Day, you should show up to work anyways and start doing your TPS reports just as if it was another Monday.
Hello, Peter. What's happening? We have sort of a problem here.
It's Columbus Day, and we're not supposed to be doing TPS reports on Columbus Day. Columbus is a national hero, the man who discovered America. Remember, Peter?
Did you see the memo about this?
Yeah, I have the memo right here. I just forgot, but it's not shipping out till tomorrow, so there's no problem.
Yeah. If you could just go ahead and make sure you do that from now on, that would be great. And I'll go ahead and make sure you get another copy of that memo. Okay?
Yeah, no, I have the memo. I've got it. It's right.
Hello, Phil. What's happening?
Jumping back to the Titanic for a moment, just as the false flag propaganda insurance scam that eliminated any chance we might have had to prevent the Federal Reserve Bank, the Titanic disaster, carefully planned and executed by the very families and cohorts of enlightened, illuminated, Luciferian people with names and addresses, and yet the good guys, the government who will chase down an innocent man and shoot him for nothing, but the people such as the Kissingers, the Bushes, the Rothschilds, and the Rockefellers of the world are allowed to frolic around on their virtual world, completely removed from the real world, which most of us are accustomed to. The soulless whores who have sold the American people and the rest of the world down the river for their own golden parachute, who seem to have masters with the spiritual ability to completely remove any semblance of empathy or love for their neighbor from the hearts of their generals and colonels, have no honor or respect for their responsibility as an elected official, since we all know they are selected, and the election is a dog and pony show to choose between candidate A, the super rich right-wing elitist from Yale, who was sworn to secret brotherhood of skull and bones during their time at Yale, or candidate B, the super rich right-wing elitist from Yale, who swore to the secret brotherhood of skull and bones during their time at Yale, whose father happened to be president during all sorts of sordid schemes. No wonder, considering W's daddy was the head of the completely corrupt and infiltrated CIA, who was supposed to have been disbanded before Kennedy was murdered in the street. These people have a magically successful track record of setting an agenda, planning their schemes to the very last detail, and having every last detail painstakingly construct and implement contingency plans, and have made it their life's mission to conceal what they know, and are taught to be manipulative and cold, calculating, quick to fire, and one hell of a good liar. But the CIA aside, these other assorted breeds of magicians and heartless, soulless tricksters, the subhuman, ultra-egotistical self-worshippers who obviously converge secretly at the very tops of all power structures, have the perfect motive and opportunity to create the news, ignore or distort the truth should it pose a threat, control the narrative and the majority of the world's subconscious opinion, as they are so mesmerized by the spectacle of the multifaceted, multi-headed beasts of whom they automatically believe anything and everything asserted to them by the beasts known as the mass media outlets, who are in fact just one facet of a mega conglomerate that literally owns and controls everything from the federal school curriculum, the monetary supply, the military-industrial complex, and even the military seats of power with alarming increase, not to forget all mass media outlets, the Vatican, and on and on and on it goes, where even the World Bank turns out to be owned by the same private conglomerate that owns virtually everything, including your home with the mortgage. And even the debt tied to each dollar we spend goes straight to the same beast, which was created to perpetually ensnare us with mesmerizing spells or hypnotic suggestion or manufacturing of consent, but ultimately manufacturing consent of our own enslavement and an entire false understanding of reality, which is accepted as true and correct by 99% of the world, and if anyone dare speak against the grain, or against the dogma of sphericity, or against the mouthpieces of the multifaceted beasts, and the gospel of Big Bang evolution, that person is automatically labeled as a ultra-fundamental Christian without any understanding of science and having a mentality belonging to an illiterate peasant 500 years ago, yet the still skeptical and scoffing viewer continue to firmly believe that you sit stuck to the side of a spinning sphere, standing perpendicular to the axis many thousands of miles from the center of curvature, in a magical, disproven force known as gravity is magically compelling you to remain fixed in your position while the sun races round the galactic center, and we notice none of that motion since we must also keep up with the sun as a satellite of it, in your theoretical nonsensical model, of course, and the sun continually maintains its lateral position in accordance with the galactic center, which races through space over 1,000,000 miles per hour. Yet all that motion, often in conflict and even more often in contradiction to physical possibility, there are days here on Earth when the air is so still, not a single leaf on a single tree will rustle, nor will a hair on your head be bothered by the wind. So, with the mass media and all forms of power controlled from the top down by a group of people who are in direct collusion but outwardly appear as totally unrelated, who have nefarious, selfish, insidious goals and a propensity to ensure their cronies make their way up the power structure, and we finally end up with the exact medium to disseminate a totally nonsensical lie, and the pre-programmed, pre-tested, dumbed-down general public who are living, breathing receptacles for information that is asserted to them by a system involving all forms of power, influence, and finance in this world. It is the multi-headed, multifaceted beast that is extremely seductive and appears to most to be righteous and truthful, who has deceived the entire world, even the very elect, which is totally possible, and is occurring right now as we speak. It's time for the truth to be revealed. It's time for the world to consider the true and correct stationary plane of existence, above which all heavenly bodies tend to orbit in perpetual flat circles around our magnetic North Pole. The majority of our population will indeed believe anything which is asserted to them by the television set, if presented properly, and asserted as factual by figures they trust, such as the president or any newscaster that's ever worn a tie and had a decent cameraman. There are exceptions to this rule which are built into the very matrix of allowable theorem, which prevent the truth from being received, regardless of the presentation or legitimacy of the assertion.
Crossover at will
Well,
either.
I look at it this way. We're losing our rights because of the Patriot Act. I would rather, and as I say in my book, and I'm so crass to say, give me liberty or give me death.
I'm with you.
I would rather take my chances with terrorism than to lose my individual rights, which are vanishing every day.
You told a story in the book about you and Senator McCain that you would have run with him in 2000 if he left the Republican Party.
Yep. If he'd have quit the Republican Party and ran as an independent, I told him I would have joined him. I do not feel that way today.
I did. The one thing I did that I read in the book that I just totally found just alien to me is this idea that you believe in 9/11 conspiracies. That you...
Well, let me tell it to you this way. Why is it that when you ask any question about 9/11, you're immediately attacked?
I'm not attacking you.
You're not, but no, I'm speaking in general. I'm not saying you guys, but I've watched people get attacked. People have their credibility attacked. My problem is I look at it and I go, how can two planes knock down 3 buildings?
Pretty easy. Those are 747.
But there were 3 buildings that went down.
Well, there was a lot of fire and there was a lot of damage.
Well, first of all, jet fuel blew up at the start. Jet fuel is 4/5. And I don't want to stay on this. I'd rather talk other things.
Yeah.
But jet fuel is 4/5 kerosene. It doesn't burn hot. So using the analogy that it could melt the metal, then propane burns hotter. So if you turn on your camp stove for 3 hours, shouldn't it melt the grates? But it doesn't, does it?
I want to take one issue
it
with...
It doesn't.
I want to...
And I just question...
He's going Rosie O'Donnell on
and
me
I
here.
do... You know, wait a minute.
That's Rosie O'Donnell.
Well, I know a little bit. They blew into powder.
But if it were true, a lot of engineers would have come out before that. I want to take issue with one thing. You actually had a talk show for a small period of time. They fired you.
No. They took me off the air and paid me
air
for 3 years and bought my silence.
You said, talking about Fox and CNN and MSNBC, you said, all the stories come from upstairs. Even though the host pretend it's them, people need to understand Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity, and the rest of them, they're not these individual rogues setting their own agendas. These guys will deny it and say they have artistic freedom. You're either going to call me a lot. I'm telling you.
Wait a minute. So in other words, you chose to talk about Anna Nicole Smith for a month and a half?
No, well, we didn't talk
about
the news.
Hold on. Let me follow up on this 9/11 thing for a second. Did the government know ahead of time?
I don't know. I'm just simply questioning the fact that it doesn't add up to me. And I do know a little about demolition. I was a member of the underwater.
But you intimated in the book that the government somehow knew where they had a tip-off, and that who do you think knew?
I don't know. I really don't know, and I can't place blame, but I have a hard problem accepting the fact that never before in history has a steel-structured building fallen to the ground at the rate of gravity, and why would the main core beams not been intact?
I want to move on.
How did they go down?
There's a lot to cover here in the book. We have a moment left.
Yep.
Corporate America and religious fanatics have teamed up, and because of that, we're on the brink of fascism.
We are in fascism, in my opinion.
This is a fascist country.
It's getting there, because if you look at what's happening right now, corporate America, I think, controls our government completely with our Democrats and Republicans. And you have, okay, let's look at the religion now. You got ministers coming out endorsing candidates. Well, at that point in time, shouldn't they lose their tax-free status? Because they're now a PAC.
You want to take away the tax. Who do you like for president?
None of the above. I wish that they would offer on all local, statewide, national elections the none of the above. So, and you laugh, but I'll tell you why. Here's why. What that says is I'm here to participate, I'm here to vote, but it's a vote of no confidence.
You have a scenario in your book
they're
about
offering. And I think that there's cases locally, nationally, and statewide where none of the above would win.
The paradigm of our highly complex world is an intricately woven, carefully misguided, universally believed blending of truth, error, misunderstanding, egotistical hyperbole, disproven fundamental premises, and deceptive organizations such as NASA and the Freemasons or their advisory boards who stand to gain immense amounts of funding, which is a scientific way of saying an assload of cash, will continue to be shoveled at NASA or RASA so long as they continue deceiving the general public that we live on a spinning sphere in the sky instead of on a stationary plane known as the ground, which is the obvious verified truth. By the way, if the sea level is level, have you ever known a giant continual convex curve to be level in any sense of the word? It's a moot point anyways. The oceans of the world have been proven to possess exactly zero curvature anyways. So what's the point in disproving Santa's beard if you've already shown Santa to be an imaginary fictitious character? It's sort of like your doppelganger who is a corporation set up in your name at the same time your parents sign a certificate of live birth and are returned a birth certificate with your name in all caps. You are supposed to be the beneficiary of this Sestui KV trust, but the ecclesiastical judicial system has made you the trustee, the judge the beneficiary, or the judge is now playing the role of you, and the prosecuting attorney is the executor of the corporation that is all you, which you didn't even know existed until just now. Jumping back to the lie of the spinning spherical Earth, which is preposterous and has been thoroughly debunked, essentially demoralizes us as another random species on another random planet and completely imprisons our minds into the confines of a single, inescapable sphere, a drop of water in an otherwise infinite sea of ever-expanding, never proven, mysterious fantasies known as space-time, or black holes, which is a mathematical spectacle indeed, but always bases its constants on a galaxy, sun, and earth in motion, yet never adequately considers the ramifications of these often conflicting and physics-defying orbital motions. The truth is, once you've taken the time to consider the world as a stationary plane and understand the deception which has been summarily disseminated across the entire world, beyond liberally, all sorts of missing puzzle pieces begin to snap into place, which otherwise didn't have a rational explanation in the conventional model of the spinning spherical Earth. Of such connections, I'll name a few so as to illustrate the point. Not to be redundant, but I think it's important to stick to topics we can irrefutably prove, and anyone can replicate or verify with a bit of research and just a dash of gumption. I think it's extremely important to theorize and extrapolate based on known facts or logically sound constants. However, theory is only ever theory, while provable facts will always remain provable facts forever, as long as there's someone around to comprehend the fact, of course. But even if they were out of the picture, a fact is still a fact, even if no one is around to comprehend it, but is no longer provable, since humans are the only beings that I know of who are capable of either proving or disproving a thing, or at least being aware of such concepts as proof or disproof. I further submit there is a huge cross-section of our society spanning all walks of life, including the theoretical physicists and flight engineers or Harvard professors and advisors to NASA, who do not understand the concept of disproving a theorem. In fact, this observation is so blatantly obvious it isn't even worth debate or argument. When you show a rational person an image of a building from beyond 60 miles away at about sea level, the globe Earth should be finished at that point. End of discussion. If you realize that a westbound flight from New York to LA is identical in duration with a return flight from LA to New York, we can end the discussion right there in terms of the Earth having no sort of axial rotation. However, the irrational majority of people who are incapable of critical thought will state one of these things after another, in some succession, but always these arguments are regurgitated, since the person in question is obviously incapable of rational, critical, skeptical thought, and will blindly just parrot what is told to them. So, in terms of the flight time conundrums, again, a flight from New York to LA is identical in duration to its return flight. The first thing most people say is,
well, the planes were both spinning at the same speed before takeoff, so they take the same amount of time in either direction.
B,
the atmosphere is spinning along with the ground below, so those flights are equal.
C,
those flights are not equal, I checked. The eastbound flights were shorter than the westbound flights, so you,
me,
are a liar.
Okay, so I'll respond to all of these points because it becomes extremely difficult to manually type out a response to every single individual who comments on this and believes they have debunked the truth, somehow usually starting with A. So A, the planes were both spinning at the same speed before takeoff, so they take the same amount of time in either direction. This was actually the nearly verbatim response of Harvard astrophysicist and advisor to NASA, Dr. Josh Grindley, during our so-called debate on August 5th of 2015 on the Art Bell Show. The problem that people seem to have with this blatant and indisputable evidence, which I've actually been considering since the very first time I flew in a plane when I was about 9 or 10 years old, is the fact that the two planes may be spinning in the same direction prior to takeoff. However, once in the air, the westbound flight should be traveling much faster relative to the ground below because it should be racing towards the destination, while the destination should be racing towards the plane. So the plane going west should have a velocity much higher than the plane going east. Remember, we do have jet engines attached to the plane going west, so it would be impossible for that plane to continue its perfectly consistent trajectory east in accordance with the ground below, as the jet engines propel the plane west. To assert that a westbound plane would continue along with the fixed frame of reference of the face of the Earth spinning east, which is indeed rotating in the opposite direction as the plane, is a logically asinine, completely unfounded, physically impossible stance that must be swallowed in order to continue believing the world is a spinning sphere. In case this is lost on you, the reason this is irrelevant is because a westbound flight from New York to LA is identical in duration to its return flight. The eastbound flight going back to New York would necessarily need to race against the spinning Earth, and even giving the plane the argument's sake or the benefit of the doubt that it could somehow keep up with the face of the Earth spinning double the speed of the max velocity of the plane. But we'll just say that the plane can keep up with the much faster Earth, even though most of the plane's energy would be spent gaining altitude and banking, and it would indeed, in gaining altitude, slowly slip out of that eastward trajectory, only lent to it by the Earth as its tires were firmly pressed to the ground, and the eastbound plane would literally need to race against the destination and catch up to arrive. Now, the fact that the two flights are identical in duration proves the world to have exactly zero axial rotation, and this should end the debate about a theoretical globe Earth right now, which has yet again been thoroughly debunked by simple common sense. By disproving axial motion, it's totally unnecessary and redundant to disprove any sort of orbital motion around the sun, because without axial rotation, orbital motion is ridiculous. It doesn't even make any sense. But however, after disproving Santa and his beard and then Rudolph, now we must disprove Rudolph's red nose as well. I should mention here, this is totally the opposite of science, and discarding failed or disproven theorem is an integral and critical step in the scientific method, which has been completely removed from theoretical physics, who should consider changing their career choice to sci-fi fantasy novelists with the utmost haste, as the demand for their brand of knowledge will soon be at an all-time low, of that I can assure you. It was a fun ride while it lasted, but the heliocentric universe of Newton and Einstein and Copernicus is going the way of the dinosaurs, and fast. You can stand up in science class and rightfully tell your teacher they are completely full of donkey poop, and you can prove it easily. Now, I don't necessarily recommend that you do that, but isn't it empowering to know that you would be righteous to do so? If you don't film it, then it never happened. Just saying. Right, okay, so the atmosphere, this is the second argument against the flight times conundrum, or B. So the atmosphere is spinning along with the ground below, so the flights are equal in duration. Much like A, this argument doesn't make any sense and is not supported by any physical evidence, only a failed attempt at rational thought which falls apart under the slightest scrutiny. So, in order for the atmosphere to be spinning in accordance with the Earth, therefore the flights are identical, completely fails to account for the relative difference in speed between objects traveling towards each other, the plane and the destination from New York to LA, being much higher, that is, the difference in speed between LA and the plane heading towards it would be much higher than the objects traveling in the same direction and racing against each other, or the plane in New York going east from LA. So, for one thing, you would necessarily experience a 1,000 mile per hour headwind on all westbound flights, while on the way back to New York, you would always necessarily experience a 1,000 mile per hour tailwind on all eastbound flights. Now, okay, so we'll use 1,000 miles an hour, but of course we're north of the equator, so it would be somewhere between 750 and 900 miles per hour. But we'll just keep the numbers round and even. We'll say that the Earth spins 1,000 and the planes go 500, when in fact they average about 456 or so. Does a plane traveling south from, say, France to South Africa need to race faster and faster east as they travel south towards the, quote, much faster spinning, end quote, area of the, quote, globe, end quote? You realize that, quote, France would be spinning at roughly 2/3 the speed of a location near the equator, and so as the plane travels south, it should begin to apparently head west, faster and faster as it goes towards the equator, where the plane should be sliding about 300 miles per hour towards the west by the time it reaches the equator. This is so very ridiculous to consider. However, such a phenomenon must occur on a spherical Earth spinning towards the east at the given rotational velocity according to latitude. At any rate, I digress. You can ask 1,000,000 pilots if they've ever experienced a 1,000 mile per hour headwind during a westbound flight, and they will all, every last one of them, look at you like you've lost your mind. The reason for this is because there are no, nor have there ever been, any 1,000 mile per hour winds on planet Earth, regardless of the plane that you're in or the direction that you're traveling. The fastest wind ever recorded was 302 miles per hour in a tornado. Now, furthermore, what about the Coriolis effect? Flights in the southern hemisphere going from east to west, so even though that is the most logically fallacious notion I've ever considered, that is the Coriolis effect, the atmosphere traveling in the opposite direction as the spin of the Earth as a rule, but only in the southern hemisphere, and the mind-controlled sheeple of the world point to this Coriolis effect as proof of a globe, which to me is extremely ironic and hilarious, and has led me to believe even more firmly that God has a divine sense of humor. And when Lucifer is finally revealed with his pants down in front of the entire world, it's going to be a rather comedic sight to behold if we're around to see it, and have the capacity to comprehend God's sense of humor, for which I have a profound respect and sense of connection or affinity towards. So, at any rate, whether you understand it or not, the two flights, again, New York to LA and back, having identical duration is alone satisfactory to completely debunk the globe-Earth model, since axial motion is a pillar of the theory, which is coming unhinged under every type of scrutiny or experiment we can test the theory against. Finally, see, the third way that they argue against the flight times conundrum is a lot of people say those flights are not equal. I checked. The westbound flights were shorter than the eastbound flights, so you, or me, I am a liar. I promise you that I took a screenshot of the two flight schedules in May of 2015, right after I did my first Flat Earth video, and the durations from LA to New York were virtually identical by airline, although each airline differed slightly. It was about 5 hours and 45 minutes on average. However, there was no indication that the westbound flights were about 3 times shorter than the eastbound flights, which is the minimum you would expect on a spinning globe going east. I did the same search a few months later, both of these searches are in my videos, time and date stamps, so I have evidence of this, but I think it was in July or August I did the exact same search and it yielded completely different durations. This time, the eastbound flights were all about 30 to 45 minutes shorter than the westbound flights. Again, the flight times were equivalent by airline, but differing slightly from airline to airline. Now, if you haven't thought this through, I'll tell you that the eastbound flights being shorter in duration than the westbound flights is the opposite of what you would expect to see on a globe spinning east. The eastbound flights should never, ever, ever be shorter than the westbound flights on a globe spinning east, period, end of story. Now, assuming both flights are non-stop and take similar routes, which they obviously do, as evidenced by the identical durations documented in my screenshots taken in May. Now, as another nail in the coffin of the Newtonian, Einsteinian, Carlos deGrassian, Stephen Hawkingian, Luciferian, Babylonian, Talmudic view of the world and our universe, the upper atmosphere adjacent to the infinite vacuum of space actually disproves the globe Earth heliocentric / infinite space model completely. And we could end this entire video yet again right here and end the debate right here without any further exploration into the subject because it is so far beyond preposterous. Talking about it could only leave us stupider than we were when we entered the conversation. That's how solid this evidence is. Modern science will assert that gravity, or an imaginary force that has never been detected or proven, but has also been completely debunked and disproved, but, quote, gravity somehow causes the upper atmosphere many miles into the air to behave in several peculiar nonsensical ways. It's amazing that even one single person bought this lie for the entire duration of our modern age of incredible gadgets and completely gullible operators of said gadgets. I submit the more advanced our gadgets get, the more stupid we become. And there's a mathematical equation that could accurately project exactly how stupid we will be at any given time in the future, but I seem to have lost my calculator, so I'll have to save that for another video. Suffice to say that it would look like a curve, with the level of intelligence getting lower and lower as the timeline increases, in proportion with the level of technology increasing along the same timeline. Now, the atmosphere, say 30 miles up, remains more or less fixed above the ground below, and this is apparent when we view footage from a weather balloon. The balloon will travel with any air currents, of course, but certainly do not travel apparently west as the high-velocity bullets that you would expect them to be in the northern hemisphere. But we won't even get into that. It's simply impossible, gravity notwithstanding, as gravity has been thoroughly debunked, but it's impossible for a body of gas to exist adjacent to a vacuum without something separating the vacuum from the body of gas. By definition, if the infinite vacuum of space were a true hypothesis, the atmosphere of our world would be constantly expanding into the infinite vastness of space. Think of filling a balloon with, say, blue gas, and then pop the balloon. Would you expect the blue gas to remain fixed in the position it held when it filled the confines of the balloon?